Hello everyone and welcome to Law for Life's video series on housing rights. Today we'll be looking at benefits and ways of managing your finances in the context of the cost of living. My name is Rowan.
And I'm Rebecca, and we are here with benefit expert Lindsay Fletcher.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Lindsay. So the current cost of living crisis has dramatically reduced the ability of people to cover basic expenses around rent, utilities, food and education, and even minor luxuries such as TV subscription. While the government has developed some reliefs, these are insufficient and many people are falling through the gaps of the system.
Yeah. So in this video, we'll be exploring how to seek financial support to cover your rent and other expenses. We'll mostly be focusing on what benefits you might be able to receive. For many people, this involves applying for universal credit for the first time or managing their existing claim. For a small number of people, this support could come by local councils through housing benefit. We'll also briefly offer some suggestions on ways of managing debt. And we've linked below the video to several useful resources that may help people with specific forms of relief or to help them understand their financial situation further. We do recognise that many people will not be eligible for financial support. However, many people who are eligible don't realise it. So it is really important to understand what you might be entitled to.
This session will cover universal credit. So who is it for, how to apply and how to manage your claim. We will focus on the housing element of the universal credit. This will include some basic information on your local housing allowance, how you may be able to receive discretionary housing payment from your local authority. We'll also focus on housing benefit, who is it for and how to apply, and other form of reliefs that you may be entitled to.
Great, so let's crack on. So Lindsay, could we please start with a brief overview of the benefits system?
Of course. So broadly speaking, there are two types of benefits. So you have means tested benefits. So these look at income and savings. So these are for people with no income or low income and to pay for the living costs and housing. Then we have non-means tested benefits. So these do not depend on your income. Instead, these are for extra costs for people with specific needs, such as people with disabilities, health problems, carers, people with children. This agency in your area, or like Citizens Advice, or a welfare rights agency. And we'll put a link below this video to the Advicenow.uk website, and that'll show you all the advice what's available in your area.
Thanks, Lindsay. So what is universal credit and what are the key features?
So universal credit has been one of the biggest changes to the welfare benefit system in the UK. So for most people, it has replaced new claims for 6 different benefits. So they are housing benefit, income related employment and support allowance. Some of them are very wordy. That's shortened to ESA quite commonly. Income based job seekers allowance, or you might have heard that called JSA. Child tax credits, working tax credits, and income support. And universal credit is different to this old benefit system of these 6 benefits for several reasons. So the first one is universal credit is a monthly payment, so one monthly payment. The amount of money you get depends on your circumstances and any income paid in that month. It's managed by the DWP through a job coach in your local job centre that you're assigned to, and that'll be your main contact point. Now, normally you would be expected to undertake work-related activities as a condition of getting your universal credit, but there is lots of flexibility around the types of activities this involves and what you need to agree to. So don't be worried about that. There is a 5-week wait for someone's first payment, and then it's monthly after that. And most claims are made and maintained online. If you are receiving any of them old 6 benefits that I just mentioned, it is extra important to get advice before applying for universal credit, because you could end up worse off and receiving less money. If you're not receiving any of them benefits, this doesn't apply to you, and it's much more simple, and it's generally advisable to apply for universal credit.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. So how do you go about making a claim for universal credit?
So there is 2 ways to claim. So you can claim online or on the telephone. So it is quickest and easiest to claim online. If you're making a new claim to universal credit, you don't need to call the DWP as part of the process. If they need to speak to you to check any of the information provided or anything, they will ring you. And you'll also get access to an online journal that you can log into, and the DWP might message you on there as well if they need to confirm anything with you. There is many people, of course, who would prefer to claim on the telephone. However, that is still possible, but you cannot just do it because you'd prefer it. There has to be some kind of reason why you need to claim on the phone rather than online. So usually some kind of vulnerability, whether that be physical or mental health problems, learning difficulties, things like that. There are also longer waiting times if you claim on the phone. So we always recommend people claim online wherever possible.
Thanks, Lindsay. So should you get help when making a claim?
If possible, we would advise everyone to approach the Citizens Advice Bureau for help making the universal credit claim, even if people are able to do it by themselves, because if they get advice and help at this stage, it can avoid mistakes or even sanctions further down the road. It usually takes about 30 to 40 minutes to fill in the online application. Now, Citizens Advice have something called the Help to Claim service, and we'll put the link below.
Great. So when you are preparing for making a claim, what kind of information might you need to be asked to provide? And what documents might you need for this?
So you'll need to provide proof of your address. So if you don't have a permanent address, you can still claim. There's still lots of options available. You could use a care of address of a relative or a trusted friend. Even if you're staying at somewhere like a hostel, often you can even use the hostel address as your address. And in really exceptional circumstances, you can even use your local job centre. You will also need proof of your rent. If you pay rent, you'll have to have proof of what you pay and how much, your landlord's address and details, and the type of accommodation that you live in, whether it be a private tenancy, housing association, or council. Next, you will need to have a bank account. Now, that can be just a basic bank account, what all banks offer and are free to open. And then your universal credit can be paid into them, and you can set up direct debits to pay your bills and things. Again, we'll put a link at the bottom of the video for information on opening basic bank account. Not all bank accounts are the same, so it might be worth trying a few different banks. If you are unwilling or unable to open an account, again, there's still options. So don't let that stop you from claiming. There's something called the Payment Exception Service that the DWP can use if you don't have a bank account. And we'll put the link to the government website for more information on that below. And finally, one stage in the claiming process is you will need to prove your identification. So again, if you can confirm and complete the ID checks online using the government's Verify service, it's very easy. Or if you've got a government gateway ID login and you've used that in the past 12 months, then you can use that to confirm your ID for your universal credit claim. But again, even if you haven't got that or you've no ID, there is still ways around it, and the DWP can help prove your identity with you.
Thanks for those details, Lindsay. So is there anything else that you might need to provide?
Other couple of additional things, you will need your national insurance number and your partner's national insurance number. You will need details of all your income, savings, ISAs, savings accounts, capital, details of your earnings if you do work, and details of any other payments or benefits that you might be getting.
So you just mentioned a partner. What is the situation if you're a couple? Do you both have to apply for universal credit?
You do. You have to make a joint claim if you're classed as living with somebody and cohabitating. Doesn't mean you have to be married or in a civil partnership. And then you need to make a joint claim, and both of your income and savings will be taken into account for the claim. And then if you ever separate or join from single claim to a partner, then you can just report that change, and it's quite simple for them to split or join universal credit claims. You don't need to make a new claim or anything. If you or your partner are getting any of them 6 benefits I mentioned earlier, which universal credit are replacing, such as tax credits, then as soon as you claim universal credit, all them stop. So this is why we said it's so important to get a benefit check first before you claim UC, just to check if it's the best thing for you to do in your situation.
Thanks. What if you're self-employed?
If you're self-employed, the calculations are quite a bit more complicated on universal credit. So what I would say, if you are self-employed and you're thinking of claiming UC, then even more of a reason to get advice first, and they can explain how it works for self-employed people.
So is there anything else you need to do when you're applying for universal credit?
So once you've claimed, before you start receiving your universal credit, you will be asked to sign something called a claimant commitment document. Very often you just sign that digitally and you agree to it online on your journal. And this is where you agree to undertake certain what they call work-related activities. So that can be hundreds of different things. So it can be looking and applying for jobs or attending job interviews, but it could also be attending work preparation courses or classes or CV writing classes or IT courses, lots of different things it can involve. Now, these, what they call conditionalities, is what you have to do to get your UC money. They're usually tailored and monitored and applied by the work coach in the job centre. So they're the ones who agree with you what you need to do. So it's really important, if you have any difficulties with managing any of the work-related activities, whether that be due to health problems, caring responsibilities, caring for young children, that you let the work coach know as soon as possible, because they have lots of discretion to reduce what you have to do. So you can negotiate that with your work coach, because ultimately you don't want to agree to things that you're not able to do. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later.
Thank you. So what happens after you lodge your claim? How long does it take before you receive the money? And what do you do during the waiting?
So once the claim's lodged, you have an assessment period which begins that day you submit your claim, and that lasts for 1 calendar month. And then the first payment is normally paid 7 days after the end of that first assessment period. So that's roughly means about 5 weeks after you make your initial claim, you'll get your first payment. And then it'll be on the same date then every month after that. If you can't wait that long, you can ask for an advance payment. And this can normally be done within 48 hours. So after you've made your claim and they've verified your ID, you can apply for the advance, either by speaking to your work coach on the phone, or ringing the Universal Credit Helpline, or on your journal. Now, this is a loan, So it must be paid back, and deductions will be made from your ongoing award for the next 24 months to repay it. If someone is repaying an advance and they're struggling, they can ask for that to be postponed and have a payment break for 3 months. So again, just get in touch with Universal Credit, either on the phone or via the journal, and you can ask for that.
Okay, thanks, Lindsay, for that general overview of applying for Universal Credit. So for a lot of people, the biggest worry is around ensuring that they can pay their rent. Could you explain a little bit more about the ways in which Universal Credit help with that?
So your housing costs will be included in your monthly Universal Credit payment. And when you look at your Universal Credit breakdown and statement, the amount for the rent will be called a housing costs element. And you will need to use this to pay your landlord the rent yourself, usually. If you are struggling to manage your money, you can request something called an alternative payment arrangement. Again, by speaking to your work coach or ringing up or going on your journal. These decisions are discretionary, which means the DWP don't have to do it. The alternative payment arrangements can be paying the housing element direct to the landlord, and that's called a managed payment to the landlord. That's the most common one. There is other ones where you can ask to be paid twice a month rather than the default of getting paid once a month if you would struggle to manage that for any reason. And again, rather than the default of all the money going to one person in a couple, you can ask for that to be split and both partners get a little bit. That's not as common, but it is possible.
Thanks for that. Now let's go into a little bit more detail. How is the housing element actually calculated?
So the housing element, first of all, depends on what kind of housing you live in. So if you can look for private housing anywhere, but you should get further advice always if there's any social housing options available to you. If you are living in the private rented sector, then they use for your Universal Credit Award something called Local Housing Allowance, or LHA. So this is what they use to calculate your housing cost element. So each local authority have published a maximum that they will pay for private rented. So we'll put a link at the bottom of the video as to how they work out what the maximum is in each area. Now, it depends on how many bedrooms they think the family or the person need. Now, one big restriction is for most single people who are under 35 who rent a house in the private sector, then they are limited to assistance up to the rate for shared accommodation. So that's quite low. So this means the costs are based on assuming you're renting a room in a shared house rather than having a house to yourself if you're under 35. So that can be a big restriction. And then any adult or couple with children is usually allocated one room for a couple. Children are expected to share a room until they are 16. If they are opposite sexes, they have to share until they are 10. But then there are some exceptions to this. So if you do have a shortfall on your rent because you live in private rented and it doesn't cover the full amount, always check if you can meet any of the exceptions to get that amount increased. Now, social housing, so housing association or council tenants, have something similar. They have a reduction sometimes in the housing element, but that's called informally the bedroom tax. So for social housing, they do look at how many bedrooms are in the actual house. And then they use the same criteria I just mentioned, where a couple needs one bedroom, children need, one or two, depending on the age and the sex. So if you have a spare bedroom, they can make a deduction from the housing element of Universal Credit. So for both these reasons and the way it's calculated, it does often mean that there is a shortfall between what Universal Credit housing element are willing to pay and the amount of rent you have to pay.
So are there any ways that this shortfall can be addressed?
So assuming you've had advice and you've maximised your housing element, like we mentioned above, then the only option potentially is to apply for something called a discretionary housing payment. Now, this is applied for from your local council. Even if you're on universal credit, you apply for a DHP from your local council. Now, it's an extra payment that the local council can pay for anyone on housing benefit or UC who are struggling with a rental shortfall. You can also use it to pay a deposit sometimes, or even rent in advance. So it's always worth contacting your local council and asking them about any of them schemes if you think that would help you. Now, DHPs don't need to be paid back, so they are a very good resource available. However, they are discretionary, which means you're not guaranteed to get it if you apply. You have to explain why you need it and explain your story as to why you need that particular help. And also they are temporary. So it's meant to help with a short-term situation. It's not meant to be relied upon long-term. They want to encourage you to move to something cheaper maybe, or something smaller. And they will often help in the meantime, but not indefinitely. Reasons that you're struggling to pay the shortfall could be, like we've just said, you're living in a house bigger than you need, so you have the bedroom tax, or you're living in a more expensive private property than the local housing allowance is willing to pay. Or it could also be restricted by something called the benefit cap, which we'll talk about more in a minute.
Thanks, Lindsay. So if there was a shortfall between your rent and the housing element, do you have to wait for your first payment of the universal credit as mentioned, or do you apply straight away for the DHP?
Yes, you do have to wait for your first universal credit payment, because you do have to be on universal credit to apply for a DHP.
So can anyone get the housing element of universal credit, or are there any exceptions to this?
So the housing element of universal credit applies to most type of rental agreements. There are some groups of people who need to apply for housing benefit to pay the rent rather than via universal credit. And then their housing benefit would be paid by the local council instead of the DWP. Now, housing benefit has been around for many years, and it's one of the benefits, the 6 benefits I mentioned earlier, which universal credit is replacing. But people still can make new claims for housing benefit nowadays, but only certain types of tenancies and people. Now, this is really useful because in these certain types of tenancies, the rent is often higher. So if they claim housing benefit, the rent can be paid directly to the landlord and it can cover that higher rent. So these groups of people who can make new claims for housing benefit and who should get the housing benefit paid rather than universal credit is people who live in temporary accommodation. So if the local authority has placed them there whilst they're processing a homelessness application, maybe, then it'd be a housing benefit application for the temporary accommodation rent rather than from UC. People who live in certain supported accommodation, so housing which has some kind of support or supervision or care attached to it. And if you're ever not sure whether a property is classed as supported and comes under housing benefit rules rather than UC, often you can just contact the local council or the home provider and they will very often know. Other types of properties where you would claim housing benefit rather than UC housing element is some domestic violence refuges and other local authority hostels. So that's the tenancies who you would claim housing benefit. And then pensioners can still make new claims for housing benefit. So single people who have reached state pension age, if you've got a couple, then both members of the couple have to have reached pension age to be able to apply for housing benefit on a new claim. And it's really important to remember that even if people are on housing benefit because they're in one of them certain tenancies, if they are working age, they would still be claiming universal credit if they've got no other income or a low income. So you'd just be on housing benefit for the rent, and you see for money for yourself, maybe partner, maybe children.
So is there any other help you can get to assist you with the housing cost?
So people can apply for council tax benefit if they have to pay council tax. This is means tested. So again, it's affected by income and savings. Each council have their own criteria and scheme, so you can contact them about their individual schemes. Even if you were on universal credit, then you still need to apply for council tax benefits separately. And there is also certain council tax reductions and exemptions and discounts, sometimes for disabilities or severe mental impairment or carers, which aren't means tested. So even if people aren't entitled to benefits, they might still be entitled to them reductions. So still contact your local council to ask about any of them.
So is there anything else you need to be aware of when you're applying for benefits?
So people should also be aware of the benefit cap we briefly mentioned earlier. So again, the benefit cap is a limit on the amount of income people can get from benefit income alone if they are working age. So it can make it really difficult for people to pay their rent and other living costs.
So in terms of the benefit cap, who could actually be affected by it?
So it only applies if you are, like I said, working age. It doesn't affect pensioners. There are exemptions. So it doesn't apply to you if you qualify for one of the exemptions. And it applies if you have total income from benefits above the cap that the government set each year. And we'll put the link below to the government website so you can find out which benefits are included in the cap. And it also has the full list there as to who is exempt. It is meant to encourage people to work. So many of the exemptions are if you cannot work. So if someone in the household has disabilities or is a carer, or if you are working, you have to be earning a certain amount to be exempt from the benefit cap. So you can look at that and see if you should be exempt from the benefit cap, or if you can apply for any of the benefits or increase your hours maybe so that you will become exempt from the benefit cap. Now, many of the people affected by the benefit cap are families with children. However, it can also affect some single people, some couples without children. Usually if they have high rent, usually private rent, they can still be affected by the benefit cap.
Okay, thanks for that, Lindsay. So we've talked about how to apply for universal credit. So after that, what happens once you start receiving the benefits? What are you required to do?
The first thing to point out, you need to make sure your universal credit claim is always up to date. So you must notify the DWP promptly of any changes, whether that be to your income, your housing, your family, children born, separations from partners, things like that. The quickest and the easiest way to notify changes is on that journal. There's a specific section where you'll press notify of a change and you'll go through that process. If you're not using a journal for any reason, you can call the helpline. But again, there's often long waiting times on the phone, so it's more advisable online. You shouldn't often just turn up at the job centre in person. Usually it's better to use a journal or ring, and then the DWP might contact you if they need any more information. And then secondly, we mentioned earlier about the work-related activities you need to do, tailored to your situation, like we said, as a condition of getting universal credit. So it's really important to do these things, like we said earlier. Otherwise, if you don't make sure you agree to something you can't achieve it.
Thank you. So with the work-related activities, what happens if you don't meet the conditionalities?
So this is why it's so important, because if you don't do what's expected of you, you could get a sanction. So this is where they take some money off you. Now, sanctions are appealable if you have a good reason a good cause, a good reason for not doing the activity. And we'll put a sanction guide link at the bottom of this video, because sanctions can be very serious. The Public Law Project did a report, and they said sanctions are often for relatively minor issues. In 2021-22, over 98% of sanctions were just for missing an interview with the work coach. So it's a strong sanction because they can take 100% of your standard allowance away for you for weeks or months, just for a relatively minor offence.
So sometimes some people might not be eligible for financial assistance, or for many reasons might fall into debt. This can be pretty scary and people can get overwhelmed. So do you have any suggestions on how to help with this situation?
So the first thing to say with this is you should never ever feel ashamed or embarrassed if you end up in debt. Try not to get overwhelmed. Seek advice as soon as possible. I think that's the key. Rather than, putting things off, get advice as soon as possible, either from your local citizens advice again, or there's other specialist debt advice services like National Debt Line. We'll put their contact links below. Now, they can give advice on all the options available to you, whether that be something called breathing space, where you get a little bit of respite from repayments for a while, or whether there be any grants available for your situation. There might be other local support services available, so you can ask about these or have a look online. And again, the sooner you seek help, the sooner the situation can be resolved. Now, the other important thing to mention is that different debts come with different consequences for not paying them back. So broadly speaking, and always seek specialist advice with this, but broadly speaking, if you're struggling and in the meantime, think about priority debts and non-priority debts. Now, just because we say something is non-priority, this doesn't mean you don't have to repay it. Just, focus on the priority if you literally, that's all you can afford to pay. Now, this is why we recommend getting specialist advice, because they can look at your individual circumstances and the best options for you. Now, priority debts, we call them priority because if you don't pay them, you can face serious consequences. So some of the debts which fall into this category would be mortgage payments, rent payments, any loans secured on your home, your gas and your electricity, your council tax, your TV license, because there's more serious consequences for not paying them, such as, you could even lose your home. Worst case scenario, if you don't pay your mortgage, if you don't pay your rent, you can be evicted. If you don't pay your gas and electricity, they can be cut off. If you don't pay your council tax, worst case scenario, again, bailiffs could be instructed. So they're the ones you want to really focus on and get advice as soon as possible if you're going to be coming into difficulties with repaying any of them. Now, non-priority debts could include things like credit cards, payday loans, catalogues, your water bill, anything unsecured. So it's still important to pay these, but like we said, you should give priority to the other priority debts and get assistance with them as soon as possible for both kind of debts, but more so with them.
Thank you so much, Lindsay, for this great overview of different ways to manage your household finances. Please do check out all the links at the bottom of the video, and we've mentioned some of them throughout. We will keep updating the resources below the video regarding packages of support, which are offered by central or local government or other sources. And remember to also look at what might be particularly available in your local area. We also have guides on several aspects of the benefit system available on our website, Advicenow, which is also listed below the video. Please do check out Advicenow, as you can find links to lots of other useful websites that help with benefits. Thank you so much for watching, and also do check out the other videos we have on housing rights. Thank you very much.